We have the question about at least one question that had to do with the forced distribution. There are many papers now that are available that show that it doesn't matter what the distribution is. You know, whether it's leptokurtic or platykurtic or normal or whatever, it has almost no effect when the data are correlated and factor analyzed, because in correlation and factor analysis, which is merely an extension of correlation, it's only sensitive to order, not the shape or the surface of the distribution, which can be almost anything. Now the reason, or one of the reasons for having a forced distribution is that even though someone will tell you, look, I just cannot make a discrimination here. I agree strongly with all 10 of these statements. I want to give all of them a +5 instead of just the 3 that you require. Now, if they threaten to walk away, you know, from the study and you want to keep them, by all means, tell them, well, follow your own inclinations, but try to stay as close as possible. As it turns out, when people are forced to do that and they claim that they're making arbitrary discriminations, you know, because I agree with all of these equally, when you come back to them sometime later, it turns out that they correlate with themselves 0.8, 0.85 or something of that nature, that they, even though they claim they're making arbitrary distinctions, they make the arbitrary distinctions the same way they did before. And so it's not all that arbitrary. They just feel like it's arbitrary. Secondly, and there are studies to show that, and in fact that goes back to a psychometric principle that was known before the turn of the century on psychophysical studies, for example, of weight. If you have two objects that are exactly the same weight and you subtract a gram or two of this one or several grams until the person can feel, ah yes, I can feel that this one is lighter than this one. Then you add a few grams so that it goes down below the person's threshold. The person can no longer discriminate, but in fact this one is lighter than that one. And then you give it to them in random order and say, you know, blindfold them and put one weight in one hand and the other weight in the other hand, which one is heavier. And so the person feels like he or she is just guessing. If that was the case, then you'd get some kind of normal curve because the person would be making random judgments. But it turns out, in fact, that they judge rightly more often than wrongly to an extent that cannot be explained by chance. So at a subliminal level, they can discriminate. And the same goes with statements. Now, another reason for using the forced distribution is that if the person has a particular attitude and they don't want to discriminate statements, but you force them to do that, that brings whatever attitude they have into play again, because there has to be some basis for them making a decision. Now, if the person just closes his eyes and randomly does it, there's nothing you can do about that. But if the person meaningfully say, well, okay, you forced me, so, oh, I don't know, I suppose this one, you know, and I guess this one. But these are really arbitrary distinctions. But what you're doing is you're forcing the person's attitude back into play. And therefore, they are revealing something by virtue of the choices that they do make. And as I say, those choices tend to be pretty reliable. You come back even a year later. Kurlinger has that report in a footnote in one of his chapters. He came back to a philosopher. Philosophers, you know, are notorious for making subtle distinctions, you know. And this one philosopher said, you know, you're forcing me to make this distinction that I can't make. I'm just making random decisions. And he came back to him 1 year later, and the man, I think it was 0.82 or something like that, still clinging to the idea that he was making random decisions, but in fact making them the same way he did before. Mm-hmm.
That point that you've just made has worked very much in our favor in dealing with health professionals. Intensely dislike passing judgments upon one another, or when asked to evaluate the quality of the performance of a student, will, if given their choice, will circle everything as excellent. Mm-hmm. However, when you force them to do it, they do grumble and they hate it, but they are able to make meaningful distinctions such that you can actually get results that show inherent differences in performance, quality of performance among individuals. And so against their own will, they're able to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, we have value system. You're interested in value clarification. You set up the experimental space so that the values are going to be clarified and brought into play. And they may kick and scream, but you sometimes have to grab nature by the throat and force nature to give up its secrets. And the forced distribution helps to do that. Again, unless they threaten to walk out and you're about to lose data or something like that, in which case you may want to say, well, now there are limits to that. I had one person once, there was a 48-item Q sort. She put 47 of them under +5 and one of them under -5. I threw that one out because, I mean, that's practically a constant. And there was no information that was there. But within very broad limits, you can let a person follow, their own lights. And even with a free distribution, you're still going to get information. In fact, if you ask the person to divide the statements into agree, disagree, and neutral, which is the first step in doing the Q sort, and then you do the final, the finer kind of sorting, you can just stop there and take the data that you have, a +1, a 0, and a -1, and you will still get the factors. If there's factor A, B, and C, you're going to get, within limits, you're probably going to get factor A, B, and C. Most of the information is in by that time. Yes?
Was already mentioned, and I think is a real problem in practical matters when sorting is when the statements are not balanced, at least in the eyes of the subject, which means that the 0 point gets to another position. I'm not quite sure to which degree in general it's a matter of the item composition, and to which degree, even if the items are balanced well, there might be some subjects for whom, for their factor they're loading on, there are only very few items on the left-hand side. What are your experiences?
Well,
what can one do to prevent it?
Well, I think in most cases, if you have, like you're doing something on social character, so you use Riesman's idea that there are inner-directed types and other-directed types and tradition-directed. Usually, somebody who's very other-directed, they just do not like the tradition-directed kinds of statements, and so they have no trouble getting some kind of balance. So usually when you have a theory that pretends to be comprehensive, claims to be comprehensive, you usually inherently have balance. If a person's of this type, they're going to disagree with statements of some other type. If you're a liberal, you're going to agree with these, you're going to disagree with the conservative statements. If you're dealing with something like ours, in which you don't really have a theory as such, but just various ingredients like technical statements and conceptual statements, there may be more of a difficulty. And surely, if you gave a few Q sorts as a kind of quasi-pilot study, and everybody's heaping them all over on the positive or the negative side, then you might, particularly if they're all doing it the same, then you might have grounds for thinking, well, maybe it's not complete. Maybe there's other things that are in here that I haven't included that you need to balance it out. But if, on the other hand, they're operating in a random kind of way, one person says, how do you expect me to do this? I agree with most of them. And somebody else says, I disagree with most of them. Then it's really not going to be a problem, even if it's skewed. I mean, you may have to take into account that these people who, if everybody who's on factor A has said that there are too many agreeable statements, you may have to take into account that for factor A, the disagree doesn't, really kick in until -2 or -3 or something like that. But you can still talk about the relative placement. Because even if they put these under 0 and say, I still agree with them and I'd like to put them up there, again, if you give it to them again, they will produce the same skewed distribution as they did before, but the item arrangement will be the same, or virtually the same, so that the factor is stable.
In the sorting process, it's an important psychological moment that the 0 point does not wander. That you have that you also the 0 point for the position of irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
So if, well, say, one study I did with students, the object to be sorted or described was the officer stereotype in various versions, ideal officer, real officer, and there were much too few items that we disagreed with.
Mm-hmm.
And so if but when they sort, they're already in the, say, -1 region, and there's still statements that are
Yeah.
positive descriptors, and now come the irrelevant.
Yeah.
They don't know where to
Yeah.
do them.
Yeah.
So I think there must be some practical tips.
Well, you know, telling them that, that these numbers from plus to minus are merely to help in the sorting process. You're not necessarily assuming, and you're going to have an interview afterwards with them, and they can give their misgivings about the nature of the distribution, that I really agree with everything down to -1 or -2. You know, you can certainly keep that information in mind. But again, when you get these factors, and we've done this before, we bring in somebody from factor A and somebody from factor B and factor C and have a discussion about whatever it is without telling them that they're in factor A, B, and C. And pretty soon, they're getting in, having discussions and debates about the things that are up around +5 and +4. You know, those are the things that concern them most. And even though they may say that statements I still agree with are down in -1 and -2, when they start debating, they're not talking about those statements. They're talking about the ones that are up at +5 and +4. So it may very well be that the 0 point isn't really fixed, but by the same token, it probably doesn't much matter to them. It's really interesting when you have, if you remember the Bakke decision 15 years ago or whenever it was, we did a study. I've always let students pick out whatever topic they want to be the focus of the course, and then that was the hot item. So we did that, and there were two factors. One was bipolar, and one was orthogonal to that. And we brought in one representative of each, and it took, without them knowing what the results were, and it took the two bipolar types about 5 minutes to sniff each other out and to realize what was at issue. And pretty soon, and they were the only ones. This other guy was sort of sitting over there kind of yawning and was not plugged into what they were doing at all. And when we finally then pulled him into it, well, what do you think? He started giving his spiel, which you could have predicted from the +5 statements as to what that was going to be, and that was of no interest to the other two. I mean, you're perfectly right. I'm not saying that phenomenon doesn't exist. If it's a well-constructed Q sample, typically the 0 point's going to be about it. And if you ask people in the course of the post-sorting interview, why did you put this under +5? Well, and they tell you. And why put this under -5? And they tell you, how about this one? And it becomes relatively unimportant to them in the interview right afterwards. So it's kind of the zone of indifference, if not a specific point of relative indifference. And it works more often than not.
Usually it's quite a lot of items, of statements, because you usually have a distribution similar to the normal distribution. That means there are lots of items in 0 and -1, +1 maybe. So regarded by content, it has some import where you put the 0 point. If there are too many items that are not really...
Well, what you can do is, for your own experiment, then, is do a little study in which you allow people to use a free distribution, and you score it. Then tell them, well, the items are still out there. Now force them into a forced distribution, and keep a second Q sort that's parallel. Then get another person, let that person, so forth, so that you have a set of Q sorts that are skewed, and you have a set of Q sorts, the same item ordering, that are in the forced distribution. Factor analyze those two sets, and you're going to get the factors A, B, and C. And the interpretation of those factors is going to be the same, virtually. And the impact of the different 0 point on that is not going to have very big effect, if any, on the interpretation that you give these people, because the differences between factors are so grand differences. I mean, we're talking about the difference between an introvert and an extrovert, or between a liberal and a conservative, are such big differences that these smaller differences play a very small role.
Sometimes may have consequences.
Oh, they might,
In
yeah.
our samples, we used on the negative side some fascist attitudes, and for subjects aligned to any of the factors, it was insult that they were aligned to a factor where certain items were still in the positive range.
Just a simple practical tip is you can ask people to draw a block line around the factors scoring grid and indicate on it where the agreement is. Just to help you interpret it. But I've also asked people to actually write a written account of what they think they're describing when they sorted the cards.
John?
This is a question probably for Peter, and it's a pragmatic. I know the program is limited to 32 sorts, and pragmatics, like I see happening, imagine a lot of editors scans.
No, it's not limited to 32. It will only print out a correlation matrix up to 32. So the first 32, it prints as the correlation, but the rest of them are in there. That could have been modified, but the correlation matrix is sort of just a phase the data passed through on the way to something more important.
So
So
how many slots can you enter in that one?
I think it's... yeah, I'm not... The one at Kent, I think it's 100. But I mean, that was just an arbitrary thing. You can...
This one?
The one on the mainframe at Kent,
It was
it's...
120.
Yeah, or 120. But that was just arbitrary. They could be changed for more.
What do you mean? The program itself could be changed.
Yes.
If you want to do more, you have somebody else to have it changed.
Well, I think it's just a matter of the dimensionality of the Fortran statements, you know, of setting it for different limits, whatever your computer can take. And now these days, you could probably put in 500. You know.
So where's the Fortran code located?
The which?
The Fortran code.
The source code is available through Peter's
Yeah.
page.
You can download the source code.
Yeah.
That's right. It's at the Whitewater web, the
Is it?
Whitewater FTP site.
Mhm.
So,
White what?
University of Wisconsin at Whitewater.
Oh,
no,
sorry.
It's at Kent too, I think. It's on the list server, I think.
Munich.
Yeah.
But tomorrow you will get a copy of this
Yeah.
program.
The disk that will be passed out tomorrow has the Fortran code in it with it too.
No.
It's part of the
Yeah.
project.
No.
Forget it. I was gonna say that.
I look.
Well, you've been awfully attentive for a long period of time. I think it's probably about time to call it quits. As you can tell, this story could go on and on. But you've been very attentive. I appreciate that. And we'll see what kind of questions pop up in the next 48 hours.